Why do the English think that they're special or different to other countries? There's a historical reason why this is the case. I want to show you why and how it's connected to the Dutch, the Netherlands. Hey, hit that subscribe button, it really helps the channel. Thank you. Much of this channel is to do with the British Isles, mainly Britain. And to understand Britain, you have to understand England. And to understand England, you have to understand why they so often think that they're somehow different to other peoples. And there is a good reason, and to understand that, you have to go to the Netherlands. The Netherlands and England both form this idea of exceptionalism, thinking that they're different to other peoples somehow. There's a reason for this, and it's an integral part of the English identity today. The Dutch lost a bit of it, and there's historical reasons why, and I'll show you why the Dutch didn't hang on to that exceptionalism so much, and why the English still do. A lot of it you saw recently in Brexit, wanting to leave the European Union. It was heavily an England-focused vote. Even in Wales, here where I am, the people who swung the vote to Brexit were English people living in Wales. It wasn't actually the Welsh who swung that vote in Wales. And so it's an integral part of this English identity. Where does it come from? This exceptionalism has its roots in several different core concepts which all merged around the same time in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Netherlands and England. So I will go through each one of those with you now. The three most urbanized areas around this time, around 1500, were northern Italy, the Netherlands, and England. Now, Italy was a bit different to the Netherlands and England. They did not think of themselves as a united polity, a nation to such an extent. They were competing city-states, very often at war with each other. So their identity did not coalesce into this sense of exceptionalism to any significant degree like it did in the Netherlands and England. There were other areas that were urban, dense population, like Paris, many cities in Germany, and Moscow or Warsaw, but these were ruled often by absolute monarchs, or in the case of northern Germany, emerging Prussia, which was a military caste. In England and the Netherlands, this was different. They were economic burghers, townsmen, traders, and they had recently advanced this, opening up new kinds of shops. So they had city privileges, towns bestowing rights upon them, which would come in direct contact with what made them different next. In these three places, Italy, England, and the Netherlands, you had the largest middle class. You had middle classes in other places, but they were in direct service of a king. And in the Netherlands and England, they were more independent because of these rights that I just mentioned, to advance themselves economically. You had a social revolution going on which was economic and aspirational, based around the individual's financial liberties. The second thing that created this sense of being special or exceptional to other peoples was absolute monarchy. In France, you had the Palace of Versailles. You had the Bourbon dynasty. You had Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruling with absolute power. To the south, you had the Kingdom of Castile, becoming the most powerful country in the world, ruling over parts of Austria as well, covering vast swathes of the world and threatening the very existence of the Netherlands and England with a vast armada. And so these Catholic powers contrasted with them wanting to worship the Protestant faith. But what this did mainly was threaten their sense of their town rights, their guild, their economic status and privileges, because in France and Spain and Bavaria, you didn't have these people so much who formed a class with their economic privileges. They were immediately subservient to the king. And we might think that's kind of strange today looking at England and its monarchy, but the English monarchy formed out of a reaction against absolute monarchy, curtailed by Parliament to safeguard the rights of these new economic aspirational classes. In the Netherlands, it was intensified in the fact that they were a republic who fought an 80-year-long war for independence against Spain, the Catholic Kingdom. They were a loose confederation without any true central authority for a long time, and this thought of an absolute monarch with a vast standing army felt very threatening to both England and the Netherlands. They wanted nothing to do with a centralized, solid power. They didn't trust government, and that ebbed into the birth of liberalism and that philosophical notion of the individual in both of these countries and their national identity. The third thing I mentioned about decentralization in the Netherlands not being a solidified thing, this was a confederation of provinces. It wasn't a single thing for quite some time, and each province had quite significant autonomy in relation to the capital in Amsterdam. It wasn't just one decides all. So in Paris, and during the days of the monarch, what said went. But in the Netherlands and England, that wasn't always the case. England did not even have a standing police force until the late 1820s and the creation of the Metropolitan Police. This is how much they had an intrinsic distrust of a standing army on their soil, because they feared also that Catholic insurrection. This became a driving force behind anti-Irish sentiment later on. There were wars in Ireland. 1607, you had the flight of the Earls, a major defeat for the Irish, and they went over to the sides of the enemies of both these two countries. And whilst England and the Netherlands didn't quite work together in the same way, they fought 4 wars against each other. Both sides won twice. England won the first one, Netherlands won twice in the middle, and England, after it absorbed Scotland, won the last one. I say absorbed Scotland, but it did keep its own laws. However, the military and economic power was certainly refocused into England. Sorry, because the Union isn't exactly quite, which sped the decline of the Netherlands and the increasing status in the psychology of the English people of being different somehow to other people. The fourth reason was, well, Catholicism. The reconstruction of national identity often has more to do with who you are not than who you are. The Protestant Reformation quickly overwhelmed the old order in the Netherlands. In England, it was a bit more violent and back and forth until you had the Tudors abolishing the monasteries, and you had significant uprisings by the Cornish in hopes of liberating themselves from this in many cases, and then trying to have books in their faith. But these were crushed, and with vehement ferocity and bloodiness on the hands of the English state, they crushed Catholic dissent without mercy, burning heretics like Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia. And there's a reason why both of these two countries faced significant violence from Catholics as well. It wasn't just one way. You had the Duke of Alba in the Netherlands, in Flanders, northern Belgium. During the war for independence, you had a duke from Castile coming up with an army committing atrocious crimes during the siege of Antwerp, one of the two great trading cities early on, and him and others taking this from the Dutch is why Amsterdam so blossomed into an economic power later on. It was free of this heavier taxation imposed by the Spanish. You also had the Armada of Spain that threatened to invade England in 1588. It's interesting to note that England never went through a revolution per se. It did, I'll get to that in a minute, but the only time that the people rose up for something was angry mobs in London in the Gordon riots, attacking and burning Catholic institutions, hatred of foreigners, burning the Bavarian embassy and the Sardinian embassy. These were Catholic kingdoms at the time, chasing or trying to chase Irish out of the city. And the fact that the biggest uprising in the 18th century in England was an anti-Catholic hate mob rather than any movement for liberation is quite telling even today, about their identity and important to understanding what Britain became and is today. In relation to what I mentioned about the emerging middle class is the fifth reason. England and the Netherlands were the most significant traders of the period. As they progressed further in terms of economic success than Italy to the south, they became the most successful bankers in the world, both England and the Netherlands. The Netherlands first and then England. The initial growth of the Dutch trading empire and the English empire was at the expense of Spanish trading vessels. They allowed people to pirate this larger empire's vessels for private profit, which of course the Dutch and English crown then took a piece out of. It enabled private enterprise to grow in a new way, founding shareholderships, inventing stock markets practically. You had nobles in England and the Netherlands engaging in trade, something which the upper classes of France and Spain felt to be below them. You did not deal with these business matters if you were wealthy enough to own landed estates. But that was not the case in England and the Netherlands. It was a sense of pride that you could change things through your economic innovation, which enabled innovation in turn in the sphere of maritime military affairs, which led to victories in war against these larger kingdoms, which led, again, to thinking that they were somehow special and different regarding their economic privileges. Carrying on from this middle class revolution, they established companies. The Dutch East India Company and the East India Company in England emerged within 2 years of each other. On the 31st of December 1600, the East India Company was founded in London, and within 2 years the Dutch East India Company had formed, amalgamated out of other companies called Voorcompagnieën, or before companies, amalgamated by the Dutch to compete and found new ports across the world in the Caribbean and India to compete with these absolutist monarch states. And what these companies allowed England and the Netherlands to do was, one, that they could finance wars by making them privatized, and that they could have commerce sucked into their ports, which enabled warehouses to be built with which they could build warships and defeat these larger nations, by far larger than they, on the seas, where their numbers didn't have such a significance. The Dutch East India Company, holding vast swathes over Indonesia and parts of South America, is believed to have been the largest ever company in recorded history. This was massive. It meant that the young Dutch Republic did not have to finance wars to such an extent. It could fight them with less money by making more money. The Glorious Revolution was basically a Dutch invasion supported by English nobles to remove the king and establish a new dynasty under William of Orange. The Glorious Revolution involved the overthrow of the Catholic King James II, who was replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. The motives for this revolution wove the political and the religious concerns of the upper classes together. This revolution ultimately changed how England was governed, giving Parliament more power over the monarchy and planting the seeds for a political hegemony that has persisted. It was a glorious revolution in the eyes of the group that would later become the Tory party, because it restored many privileges in a way, and it secured the abolishment of any sense of this absolute rule by curtailing the powers of the king and enfranchising these groups of landed barons and lords by creating an aspirational middle class dependent upon them. They say the Glorious Revolution of 1688 began in a coffee shop, because this is where Lloyd's of London, the company, was founded, and these financiers would help the Glorious Revolution establish itself. It was a clever move, and it created the order that exists in England to this day. In the Netherlands, it was a bit different. You did have a monarchy that came back, ruling over the republic, which then became a monarchy, but it wasn't in the same way. And it was more so in England from this point that this exceptionalism, this walling yourself off to others, really began to ferment and take much stronger shape. The sixth reason is that there was an agricultural revolution in both of these countries, actually. These were smaller countries, but they found ways to produce much more food. So in the Netherlands, you had the dike system and reclaiming land, using mills and all sorts of innovating technologies. Between 1590 and 1615, you had 36,000 square kilometers retaken from the sea, creating arable land that could grow crops. In England, you reclaimed much of the fens, you had drainage of that, and you had something new in regarding crop rotation, growing different crops at different times of the year where before you hadn't done that, and they were creating much more food surplus than they had before, which means that you could feed an army. And in the case of the Netherlands, they were selling grain to Denmark and Scandinavia, and England then also later on sold its grains to far-flung lands, creating a surplus to finance its wars, enabling it to sustain itself in both these cases alone. This reinforced the idea that they were special and unlike other peoples, that they had these privileges, that they had the right to not be touched by others. England won a series of wars in the 1700s as it became Great Britain, basically annexing the Scottish, and victory in the Napoleonic Wars, which it avoided large-scale devastation from which the Dutch didn't exactly escape unscathed. And in 1831, the Dutch lost the southern parts of their country with the founding of Belgium. And so their empire declined. They lost New York. They lost other bits around the globe as well. They lost the African Cape in South Africa to the English. And the English went from strength to strength. So they never lost that sense of feeling that they're special somehow. And they felt that their privileges were protected and they were entitled to them. And that led eventually to Brexit, fearing, being afraid of an other that would remove their privileges with the threat of a solitary monarch, a centralizing force that would threaten this identity that formed out of the Protestant Reformation, but had hints even earlier, as you can read in Shakespeare. And so this exceptionalism, especially in England, carried on, in that they wanted to define themselves against the Irish, against the French, against the military Prussian state, and against, well, early on, the Habsburg dynasty. The English and Dutch became a reaction against what they saw as threatening to them. And so they wanted to exempt themselves from this centralizing monarchist force, in Catholicism chiefly. I hope you enjoyed this video and you see now that the English exceptionalism which created Brexit has deep, deep cultural roots. And it's not just some phenomenon that happened for no reason. This goes back centuries. Hey, diolch yn fawr am wylio. Thank you very much for watching.